Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. In today's video, I wanted to show you some easy color mixing techniques that you can use with your watercolor paints. If you're new to watercolors or any sort of painting, color mixing can be very intimidating. For a very long time, I would not look at mixing, I was not comfortable with the idea of mixing, and for me it was a very intimidating process. And so today I want to share with you a few of the simple techniques that will get you started down the road of watercolor mixing. So when we're talking about watercolors, there's a lot of different theories about how to mix color. Some people would say just use yellow, red, and blue, and you can get every color that you need from that. That is true, but for most of us, that is so overwhelming. The idea of I'm only gonna use 3 colors and mix everything, that just seems like too much. So what I'm going to be using today is my watercolor palette that I've been expanding over the last couple of years. So I have some earth tones, I have 3 yellows, I have a couple cooler reds and warmer reds, some orange, some violet, greens, and blues. So that is basically my full palette that I usually use in my watercolor paintings. And so why you would maybe want to have more colors versus less is, for example, I added in a sap green, and that's more just so that I can mix some of those greens a little bit faster by adding other colors instead of always having to try to get to the sap green and then add color from there. And so sometimes you want certain colors in your palette as more of a shortcut, or because it would take a while to mix those colors and maybe you're not interested in spending that much time. Maybe you don't have that much time to paint and you want to try to speed that up. Some of the warmer versus cooler reds, some of that has to do with what colors will mix well together using certain undertones in the paint. And for some of these, I just like having them because I like having a warmer red and a cooler red, a warmer yellow, a cooler yellow. It helps with the color mixing process. So first of all, we're going to start talking about the color wheel. And when we're looking at the color wheel, you'll notice that really there's 3 main colors. You have your primaries, your yellow, red, and blue. And technically from that, you can mix any color that you want. But then there's the secondary colors, which are the orange, the green, and the violet. And with the orange, green, and violet, those are your secondary colors. And so again, the orange is a mix of red and yellow, green is a mix of blue and yellow, and violet is a mix of blue and red. When we're talking about primary and secondary colors, it's a very simple concept, but it's a little bit more complex when you start mixing colors. So in this example, you will see that I have made purple. I've actually made purple 3 different ways, but not every purple is a beautiful, vibrant purple. So by mixing a cool blue and a cool red, I'm getting quite a muddy and deep colored purple, which you may or may not want in your painting depending on what aesthetic you're going for. By using more of a warm blue and a warm red, you get more of that really light purple. And I could have actually gone a little bit deeper with this hue if I'd added a little bit more paint. And then adding a warm blue and a cool red, I'm adding a different color of purple. Just because you're mixing purple doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the exact purple that you're looking for. And that's where color mixing really comes into place. Is you need to be aware of which colors are cool and which colors are warm and what colors you'll get when you mix these 2 together. So I have several color charts here that I want to share with you today. If you would like me to show you how to mix a color chart, let me know. I'd be more than happy to share that in a separate video. So in this color chart, you'll see that I have a cool yellow and a warm yellow. I have a cool red and a warm red. I have a warm blue and a cool blue. And that by mixing these same colors along the top, where these intersect is what combination you'll get of these colors. So you can see here the difference between even the warm blue and the cool blue with the cool yellow gives you a very different effect. By adding the 2 cools together, you get this very kind of deeper teal color. While using a warm blue and a cool yellow, you get more of this kind of leaf green color. And so as I went down the color chart, you can see how certain ones end up with more mud and less vibrant hues, and other ones end up with warmer hues. And so that's something to consider when you're getting into color mixing, is that you get a lot of different tones depending on which colors you mix together. And one of the easiest ways to learn this is through a color chart. So with this color chart, what you'll notice is I end up having the yellows, blues, and reds. So what I ended up doing is I actually ended up mixing these with the colors that were opposite on the color wheel. And you can see how you went from more of a vibrant color to a more muddy color. And so we don't always want to be creating mud, but it's nice to know that as you're moving in this direction, that by adding certain colors to it, you get a lot of these more muted tones. And that is a muted tone, but not a mud tone. But if the idea of sitting and making a chart isn't exciting for you, I wanted to share with you one of the exercises I like to do in my art journal that turns into a beautiful art journal page, but is a great way of learning color mixing. So the first thing we want to do is start adding some water to our colors. If you want to add a lot of water to these, sometimes I like using a pipette, but today I'm just going to use a little bit of water and my watercolor brush, and I'm going to start putting some color down in my palette. And so in this case, I'm starting with a little bit of turquoise, and I'm also going to grab, my brush wasn't all that clean there, I'm going to use some burnt sienna as well. So you can see that even because I had some blue on my brush, still when I went into the burnt sienna, that's now made a little bit of a deeper tone. And that's exactly what we're looking to do here today. And so you might notice I'm using two different containers of water. Usually this one container is my dirty water, then I pick up clean water in my other container, and then that's what I dip into some of these. I'm also going to be using a little bit of burnt umber for this as well. It allows me to get that really dark color that sometimes I would want on these rocks. I'm also going to be using some Payne's Gray today. So I'm going to start by adding a little bit of the Payne's Gray to a little bit of the turquoise. So you can see I've moved from a very bright tone to more muted tone. I'm just going to add my very first rock onto my surface. And I apologize if you hear the wind. We're having a Chinook here today in Calgary, and it is quite breezy and quite noisy. There you go. So you have your basic rock shape. Now, what if you want to add a little bit of more brightness to that? You can dip with your turquoise. We're doing a wet on wet technique here. And if you're interested in some information about wet and wet, I have that in also one of my previous videos. And so that's a way you can add shape, you can add dimension by having this side lighter and this side darker. It adds an idea of shadow, the idea of dimension to your rock. So let's go in with some burnt sienna. And we could go just straight with the burnt sienna onto the surface. You want to make sure that these don't touch each other, because if they touch each other, then they will bleed into each other, unless that's what you're wanting to do. And these shapes, all rocks are different. They're not all the same shape. So you could choose to make them quite uniform, or you could choose to give them really weird edges to them like that. There's never an end to the different shapes you can put in. And so I like that burnt sienna, but I want to mix it with a little bit of that turquoise. And so now I'm getting this more greenish tone to it. Almost kind of this green-gray tone. And so in that case, I'm just going to do a lot of it there and just leave one area that's kind of just normal, and I'm going to actually go back in and add a little bit more burnt sienna. So as you can see, we're getting different tones, different values, just from a couple colors. And if you don't like these muted tones, you could go really bright with it. But one thing I've been learning as I've been painting a lot more is that those bright tones I'm trying to use a little bit more carefully so that they accent over taking over an entire painting. And so we can do some smaller rocks in here too. And we can always add in a little bit more of the Payne's Gray, add a little bit more dimension to that rock. And I like leaving areas that are just more one color, and then that way it gives a little bit more dimension to the rock and adds a little bit more character to what we're doing here today. I'm actually going to go with a tiny bit of soft greens. I like what I'm doing here, but I wanted to bring in a little bit more of that green feel to it. I'm doing a big long guy. He's quite a green rock. I didn't mean to go quite this deep. And I'm using a size 10 brush for this particular exercise. I would say use a larger brush for this over a smaller brush. You're going to get better mix. Usually I only use the really tiny brushes for really small areas of detail or for details at the end. You definitely get a better mix when you use a larger brush. But just take some practice. So if you are new to this, don't be totally hard on yourself to use a really large brush. But that's why I've kept it very simple shapes for this exercise. It's a really great way of just adding in color and learning how to mix well. And so this rock is not nearly as dark as I was hoping it would be. So I'm just going to go with some straight Payne's Gray onto the surface. Let's maybe even go in with a little bit of New Gamboge in with that green. And so what you'll notice as well too is I'm not mixing a whole new bit of color. What I'm doing is I'm dipping into color I've already put down, and adding to it. And that's a really great way that you can continue just to add different textures, different colors in, but it gives it a sense of harmony. So instead of everything being, this is really bright purple that has nothing to do with this blue, instead by mixing a little bit of purple and that blue together, it gives you a much more harmonious color. And it's one thing that I've been learning a lot in my paintings is some of the paintings that you like the most are the ones with a lot of color harmony in them. So let's go in with some more New Gamboge. New Gamboge and raw umber. If your brush slips, you just change your shape a little bit. And so I'm not being as harmonious with this one as well. Part of that is because it is a mixing exercise, and I just really want to show you kind of how far you can take some of these things. But things like the Payne's Gray and some of these colors can end up kind of providing a little bit of harmony to the fact that I'm using a lot of different colors in the color wheel for this. Just mixing the cerulean with a little bit of Payne's. And you'll notice that I end up with a little bit of a different shade and a different feel than I did with some of these other rocks. These colors are similar, and by adding Payne's and other colors to them, it does bring them a little bit closer into a different color family, but it does definitely give a different feel to it. In this case, use a tiny bit of the yellow ochre, mix with the blue. That's made that quite green, which is a little bit greener than I really wanted it to be, so what I might do is come back in with a little bit more blue. Why I love this exercise so much is it's a really great way of getting familiar with your paints. It's a fun way of learning how to use your paints, and especially if you're not comfortable with the idea of your own painting. For years, I believed I would never know how to paint, and I would never be able to paint, and that I wasn't an artist, and I believed all these things about myself that weren't really true. And I've been finding that through just the process of learning to paint, it's been tearing down those walls, tearing down all those things that I believed about myself, and just giving it a try, and seeing what I can accomplish. And now I have become very addicted to painting. I love the process of it. I feel like it's going to be a lifelong journey of learning and getting better. I love just the process of just pulling out my paintbrush and seeing what I can come up with. So now we're going to add some ultramarine blue. This is one of my favorite blues to mix with. It's usually what I use for my warm blue, and it has such a great color that I use it all the time in my paintings. And so maybe you're wondering why the rocks. The rocks for me has been something that's been on my mind a lot lately. It's something I've been talking to my husband a lot about the idea of the big rocks in our lives. If you've ever read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you will probably have heard about the idea of the big rocks. And it's something that I like to try to use in my life. When I was goal setting earlier this year, and if you haven't seen that goal setting video, I do have it linked below. Goal setting for me has always been something that I'm like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do all these things, and then I have a really hard time following through and actually doing them. And some of that is I usually end up having too many goals. My goals weren't well defined, and I think sometimes I'm just really ambitious about what I think it can really get done in a year. And so there's something to be said about goal setting, because goal setting is really important, and I do it all the time in my own life, but it's also coming up with like what's really important to you. Maybe I'm the only one who has this, but I run into the small things in life that are least important but are high stressors end up taking over all my time. And so instead of spending my time on my big rocks, like I want to learn how to paint better, I want to spend more time with my husband, I want to get a little bit more exercise this year and be able to be a lot more fit. All those things end up going away because there's a stressor. And those things do happen. And then sometimes they do need to really be dealt with. But sometimes I deal with the most stressful thing in my life instead of dealing with the most important thing in my life. This is where the idea of the big rocks really resonates for me, is the idea that, yes, there's always going to be a distraction. There's always going to be someone wanting my time, my energy, and I need to decide what's important to me. And those things have to come first. The idea is big rocks, medium rocks, and small rocks or sand. And the idea is that if you put the big rocks in first, everything else will fit around it. But if you start with the sand, you'll never get the big rocks in. And it's a simple analogy, but it's been very important for me just because I find that so often I'm telling myself, is this a big rock? Is this a big rock? Do I really care about this? Or is this something I'm feeling pressure to do? Or is this something that I feel like obligated to do instead of focusing on the things that are really important to me? And it's been a really good reminder to just really figure out like what's important to me. What do I want to focus on? Like I really want to do 12 to 24 paintings being painted this year. I've done 2. I'm not as far along as I had hoped, but I'm still working on it. But to have that time to do that, that means I have to sacrifice something else. And that's not always easy for me because I want to do everything and have the time for these things. But if you don't take the time for those things, it's going to be another 5 years has passed by and I will be no farther ahead as I wanted to in my art and my other things. So I've really had to have the self-discipline of, yes, everyone else is busy doing this or that, but I'm going to choose the artist's life because that's what makes me happy, that's what makes me healthy, and that allows me to meet the goals that I want to meet. That, yeah, it means a certain amount of sacrifice, but I'm willing to have that sacrifice just so that I can end up in the place that I want to be. So I'm going to continue on and continue to add color in and playing around with these rocks and figuring out what new color combinations I want. And this is a really fun way of just adding new colors and come up with new combinations. So what you'll notice too is that sometimes I will just grab a color and then I will grab another completely different pool of color and add it on in. I will sometimes mix the pools of colors together. And this is where you can just start playing around, figuring out what works for you. What do you like? What do you really not like in some of these watercolors? And it's just a really fun way of just exploring color. And there's not a lot of sacrifice to this. What's the worst thing that happens? You have one piece of paper that didn't totally work out. And that's okay, but I feel like you can learn so much through this, and especially if you want to start learning how to paint shapes, or you want to start getting an idea of like how you could add color to your projects. It's a really great way of doing it that doesn't feel really stressful. It's just large shapes. Just keep painting those shapes, keep adding those colors until you finish. So I'm just going to continue on and just continue to add color onto all these shapes. So now that I've finished adding my watercolors, the next thing I want to do is let it dry, or in this case I used a heat gun just to try to speed up the process a little bit. I generally prefer to let it just air dry. I feel like it has a better long-term effect on how the watercolors look on the page. But now I really want to move on and add a little bit of journaling and a little bit of personal touches to this page. And because the bottom's still a little bit wet, I'm just going to flip this over. And then you have a choice. You could add in a bunch of doodles and little rocks in between all of these rocks. In this case, what I'm just going to do is just take my pen and I am outlining my rocks. And part of that is I had started adding rocks and then I started adding these really small ones. The problem with the small ones is how they're overlapping the other ones. If I had less of those small rocks and more of the mid-sized or large rocks, a lot of that white space just kind of gives it a good definition. But in this case, because I've overlapped a few things and let things bleed into each other, I feel like I could really use a little bit of an edge on this. So I spent a few minutes just adding some of my big rocks onto my page. So I started with the question, what are my big rocks? And then I also went on to add some of my big rocks in. And some of these ones are my mental and physical health, family, friends, some of these large things in my life that really need to be priorities. And then amongst them, I also had some more medium-sized rocks. Those were some of my hobbies and some of the things that are really important to me, but maybe are not as vital as those big rocks. And then lastly, I added in amongst some of the smaller rocks some of the things that I feel that are necessary in life, but sometimes I put them ahead of the big rocks in my life. And so I hope this is giving you some ideas on how to start playing with color mixing with your watercolor paints, as well as maybe ask yourself this question, what are the big rocks in my life? And so I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, if you could like it, subscribe, and hit that notification so you don't miss on any future videos. And if you've enjoyed this color mixing video, please let me know, and if you feel like I haven't covered something that you would like to know about, just let me know. I'm more than happy to make some more videos about color mixing. I think for me, it's been such a huge movement forward in my own creative practice. I would love to share what I've learned with you. And if you would like to see a little bit more about some of these color charts and some of these resources, you can see the photos on my website, hopalongstudio.com. And there I also have all the pictures and written instructions for this project. I hope you have a really great week, that you take some time for some personal self-care, and I will see you next time.